Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. This episode of the New Stack Makers is sponsored by the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Software is at the center of business, and open source is at the center of software. With Cloud Foundry, businesses can make running software at scale a reality. Learn more about Cloud Foundry at cloudfoundry.org. Hey, it's Alex Williams, the New Stack, here in Basel, Switzerland for the Cloud Foundry Summit, where we've been live streaming and podcasting for the past several hours. And you can tell it has been several hours, but we were talking about a Vulcan mind meld before, but we'll get to that in a bit. I'm here with Tammy Van Hove, a distinguished engineer with IBM. Hi, Tammy.
Hi, Alex.
And Simon Moser, senior technical staff member, IBM Germany Research and Development. And so Vulcan mind melds, and like we were saying, how that is dating us all, because Star Trek, I do remember the early days of Star Trek. I remember being in college, and we would watch Star Trek, and then Kung Fu,
yeah,
and then we would watch Letterman. Those are still, I think, the days where they were there. I think that was actually kind of like maybe even Star Trek was like, had been around for a while, but that speaks to kind of the, in many ways, kind of the way we think about technology now, right? It's like, when are things dated, and like when is like the developer experience dated? And that's what I really would love to talk about, is the developer experience and how you think about it today. How do you think about that today, and how you think about it in context of your entire career? So just love to get some thoughts on that developer experience now, and what is it about it that distinguishes itself from, your own technology past and career?
Well, since we've already dated ourselves with the Vulcan mind meld.
Yeah.
My first memories from Star Trek were I wanted the communicator. I wanted that communicator, and then when the first flip phones came out, I went, oh, I got a communicator, right? So the developer experience today, I think, is it's so varied and community. It's global. Where when I first started programming, it was terminals and terminal rooms, and I'm not quite old enough for the card punch days,
right.
But it was terminals and terminal rooms, and resources were limited. I mean, you had what your company had, and that was it. And now your company, from a coding resource perspective, your library is the world. There's open source, and when I first started developing in open source, I was like, wow, there's so many other people here that are contributing and that we can share ideas with and leverage what's being produced.
I can just add to that. I think for me the biggest change when I look at going back to my career, which is not as long as Tammy's, obviously, but going back to my career and looking at the various tools or the various changes in developer experience, it's really the major difference that I see today is a developer today. It's no longer about only developing the code. You're always thinking about also running the code, right? It's not, you do not have this clear distinction. When I started as after grad school, started with my Eclipse, and I built my Java, and I had to manage all my dependencies, and it was all this nasty thing. But at the end of the day, I had something built, some jar file, something that I could run, and that was the end of my day. I didn't even bother about deployments at that point in time because I just didn't have to. No one was asking me for that. Now, if you look at that today, developing actually means deploying, because it's just one continuous cycle all the time. I might have ran a bunch of unit tests back then, but it's definitely a way different experience, and it requires a way different skill set, a way different thinking than it used to a couple of years back.
Yeah, and just to add to that, that whole DevOps experience where you're not just writing code and throwing it over the wall to somebody. And I went through the Agile transformations and the DevOps transformation, and Agile is what really captured my developer mindset, where I didn't have to, work for months and spit out a finished product. I could spin and I could iterate and I could do things quickly. And then the whole DevOps model and tool chains to support that really increased velocity, and also automation became a big part of a developer experience, where I'm not going to throw it over the wall for someone else to test. It's got to be test driven, and to improve that velocity too of the team, automation and using the tool chains to support that automation become really important, because the hard part is actually deploying and operating the code in the end, not writing it.
And I mean, the most mind-boggling experience for me was actually when I first learned about TDD. That was really the
First learned about what?
TDD, test-driven development, right? That was really the point where all the things that I've been missing so far. And it honestly, on the very first time, I was scared. I was thinking, okay, I could never mock up. I'm programming against this large system. How am I supposed to mock up a system response and write a system test against this thing? Like, this is never going to be the real deal.
Before you even write the code, right?
Before you even write the code.
What was it about it? What was so intimidating about it?
Well, I mean, it was just like, it was a complex. I mean, at the time when I first started with TDD, that was like an Eclipse kind of a project at that time, and it was super intimidating. Like, basically saying, hey, I have to write this facade that simulates the responses from all this entire multi-hundred thousand of code line system behind it. And I just didn't believe it. I was like, okay, it's never going to be like whatever I mock up is never going to be what the real thing will respond in the end, so my test is going to be useless from the start. Of course I was damn wrong on that thing, right? I was really, really wrong about it. But it took, it took me to get my hands dirty and experience it, and that really changed my mind. And this is what I'm saying. Then the tools and then the mindset come together to, how the experience or the developer experience is today. And there are better suited tools for this, and there are other suited tools for this, and there are better suited roles, and there are less suited roles. And even today, if you look at some of the operators getting into the software development kind of mind scheme, because maybe they can get a better salary. Developers get paid better than operators do. So that's one way to I'll do DevOps. I was an operator. Let me do things like I did in Bash script, but let me get paid like a developer here, right? So so there is this other trend coming in from this different direction, and it's all blending at the moment. So interesting times.
Career advice, huh? So maybe that you want to think about the developer experience, I guess, when you're thinking about your career development these days. In many ways, it's very true, though, isn't it?
Yeah, most definitely, because a developer's role is end-to-end these days, right? It's not just write code, compile, and you're done. As Simon said, test-driven development, even pair programming. There's a skill in pair programming too, where you and a buddy are sharing a development effort and improving each other's coding skills because of that, and you bring an expertise, instant reviews, and you can help each other become better developers there too. So it is a different environment. You're not just locking yourself in an office anymore and writing code and submitting it. You're collaborating throughout the whole process, end to end, from development to delivery and operating.
Is that changing the way people code then? I mean, there's so many stories about developers and how don't let them get out of the zone. Don't let them get out of the zone. Like, they're in the zone. Do not bother that person. They're in the zone. I imagine it's still true, but it's a different kind of a
Different zone?
I think the scope of the zone is different, right? So, and again, I mean, just speaking for myself, if we would have had that kind of conversation, let's say 5 years back, and you would have pointed me to say, hey, did you ever care about metrics when you are writing your software? Like, are you emitting, like if you do some kind of computation, do you think about emitting a metric that maybe how long that computation took? I would have probably looked at you like, Captain Kirk before he was born. right?
Oh yeah, and I
You've
want
been-
and
you've
there's
been not
and
my job.
Let's
That's
not
the
let's not give the
performance
answer.
team's
Maybe
job.
we should ask actually the live stream audience out there. What would be the question? What's the future? What
Yeah,
is
where's the birthplace? Where's the future
Where's the
birthplace
future
of Captain James T. Kirk?
Yeah, so if anyone is watching this live stream and you have the answer to that, reply to us at the News Stack and Twitter account, and we'll see who is the winner here.
But just to add a little bit to what Simon was saying there, instrumentation for the purpose of metrics and measuring your code, whether it's performance or throughput performance, whatever it may be, and also structuring it, really taking advantage of microservices architecture and not monolithic programs and applications anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, this is really. I mean, when you're talking about the zone, so I think there is still a zone where a developer lives, and I would still agree that do not get the developer out of this zone. And I think there are some boundaries where a developer just does not feel comfy. Like, some of my developers, if you start putting them in front of a customer, they start becoming really uncomfy. So that's definitely not in their zone. But from a technical point of view, that zone definitely enlarged as things like operational aspects, metering, monitoring, test-driven development, pair programming, new tools got into their zone. And of course, as everyone that every human being that wants to grow, they adopted and enlarged the zone.
And I think too that zone is knowing their technology domain and their space and what's happening in that space and what open source community-driven code there may be to draw upon and how they can leverage that in their own deliverables. And so that zone, Simon says, is a bigger zone, but it's still a developer zone.
That story you tell too, though, about the developer experience and how continuous delivery is affecting it so much from the build to deploy to manage, and that's how we characterize our own coverage. We think of at-scale development, deployment, and management. Mm-hmm. But what you're saying is saying that it's not necessarily that as much anymore. There's a much more of a blending of those roles.
Yeah, and I think that's true and sometimes, scope and complexity of the project is going to have a factor here too. The more complex a project gets, and then, the roles might be more delineated, but certainly on smaller projects, there is a blending of those roles, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, to some extent, this traditional view of, I don't know, what did you just characterize it, development, deployment, and management, or operations, or something like that? Many of the enterprises out there are exactly set up in that kind of thing, and that actually I think the shift that has been happening in the industry, or is still happening, it's not completed by far, but it is still happening in the industry, is that when 5 years back or a few years back you had maybe a database operations team, and they knew how to operate a certain type of database, and they were really good at that kind of stuff. With a microservice architecture approach, each of the services team has to maintain their own data store, because they say it's our data store and we have to have an end-to-end responsibility. We own it, we run it. That's our thing, right? So that centralized database team that you have in your management pillar, as you just said it, Alex, that is now becoming a little bit of a problem if they are supposed to run your data store, and now you have to start interacting with them all the time and say, hey, I need this schema change, and then the guy comes back and says, no, you can't change the schema. And it's like, well, I've been doing this in my TDT pipeline, I've been doing this in my CI/CD pipeline. Of course I can change the schema because I know that my code works even with a new schema, so just apply that change for me. And this is where the friction then comes in, and why these boundaries are blending, and why if you're not blending them, you're kind of enforcing Conway's law, which I think everybody's familiar here, right?
You should explain it. Not everyone. Probably in the audience. There may be some people who are not familiar with it.
Yeah, there's this law of Conway, who, like, I think he was a systems engineer in the 60s or so, and he basically created a law that says organizations that build system build systems, build these systems according to the communication structures of the organization, right? So if you build a compiler and you have 3 teams that are building this compiler, you're damn sure end up with a compiler that has 3 layers, because each team will just take care of whatever layer they are there. So if you want to overcome that kind of limitation and move into some more of a like a cloud native model, that is a necessity to blend these layers in one way or the other, to get to overcome the restrictions that Conway's law would naturally apply on the building organization.
But by the same token, in a microservices architecture, you're consuming other services. Like in the cloud, there are service delivery teams, right, responsible for that service and knows the ins and outs of that service. So there's a level of trust in using that service that you gain, in incorporating that into your development project. But there still is an awareness of how to use that service, what the metrics of that service mean in overall consumption of the project that you're developing and using, composing from those sets of services. So it is a blended. There is that need, that blended need to understand consumption of the services, even if you're not a detailed, database administrator.
Well, I mean, yeah. So one other way to look at that is also from where are we coming when we're looking at the developer experience, and what are the right tools. And being here at the Cloud Foundry Summit, and listening into some of the themes that have been wandering around the conference around integrating Cloud Foundry with Kubernetes, these kind of things. I think all of those discussions and all those topics are kind of blending into this discussion that we're just having, because if you are, and I'm going to draw this a little bit more black and white than I actually mean it, just to make the point. When you're looking at it from a Kubernetes perspective, this is a very I'm going to call it operator-centric developer experience, right? Because you are dealing a lot with configuration files, you're editing configuration files, you're doing these kind of things, you're doing all the stuff that you have been doing in the past. They have a little bit more of a developy kind of touch to it, because you're maintaining these config files maybe in a Git repository, in a source code repository. So you're transforming your way into a world that you didn't have necessarily some time back. But then again, you get this other side of the house, which is the people traditionally using, let's say, Cloud Foundry, who are basically saying, hey, I don't want to care about this. I mean, I know I have to deal with this operational stuff, but I really don't want to. All I want to is I want to care about my code. And I want to have this platform that takes care of this all that rest of me, right? So this developer experience, at the bottom and at the top of that stack, and now coming together as we've been seeing today and as part of the conferences here, I think that's a drastic change in our industry that we all should be looking forward.
And I think too, with enterprises moving workloads to cloud, one of the key concerns there is data security and data isolation, and how do they keep their mission critical applications and data separate from mine from yours. And so that too becomes part of an a developer experience concern, is when you're composing solutions from services available in the cloud, like Cloud Foundry, and like a data service, a data store service, is compliance to security standards within your company are now a core concern, where in the 5 years ago it may have been less so than it is today, particularly for those enterprises making that leap or that bridge to cloud and starting to move their production workloads there.
Adding to the zone.
And into the zone.
And into the zone. Into the zone we go. At IBM and your own processes, how they changed, we look at a lot of our approach through the people's eyes. Like when we write our ebooks, for example, we think about the people, right? And like the teams who are building applications, technologies, and the workflows that they follow. and then the technologies that they adopt accordingly to kind of to fit their workflows or to adapt their workflows to the technology. At IBM, how's that transforming? How are you experiencing that?
Second.
So I'll start then. So Simon and I are both in IBM Cloud's organization and responsible for delivery of the Cloud Foundry service in all of its formats in the cloud, multi-tenant shared, dedicated private instances of the cloud. And one of the things that has changed dramatically for IBM Cloud over the last couple of years is internally standardizing on practices of how we deliver services in our cloud, and to ensure that the cloud end-to-end meets certain regulatory compliance standards or is ready to meet regulatory compliance standards, because we know our clients are going to be consuming those services, and they don't want to build that in their application. They want the cloud to provide that. So we are standardizing on certain technologies, but it's not a hard and fast configuration. It's a technology choice. We've also organized around service delivery. So I lead the tribe that delivers the Cloud Foundry services in the IBM Cloud. So and the tribe is responsible for the whole DevOps cycle of that Cloud Foundry service delivery, including maintaining that as a service on the cloud. And certainly we collaborate with other tribes, in the organization.
That's how you describe it, as tribes?
Yeah, that's how we describe it as tribe. Adopt the agile name. So we have squads and tribes and guilds, and so that's how we're structured. And that's allowed us to really focus on service delivery, a function as a service on the cloud, adopting best practices across the cloud, so we have consistency across the cloud. And then there are some tools that we'll standardize on or that we'll adopt more generally, but there's a lot of flexibility still there too, because the higher up the stack you go, your needs change. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. And so we allow the tribes have that flexibility to do and adopt tools and practices that make most sense for the service that they're delivering and their target customer set.
And I think another aspect, just to add to what Tammy has been saying, is some of the roles that many of the enterprises had in the past are just, either transforming or going away. Like, for example, when I go back like 10 years in time, when we were basically shipping packaged software, there was a role of a project manager kind of person, right, that was maybe not even technical. Like his responsibility was just to manage that overall thing, and you basically had one of these for like every two little tiny component tree, and they were doing a lot of paperwork and up the chain reporting and doing all these kind of works. I don't see these anymore in these days. Like that job kind of went away. And the reason why it went away is you still have someone who is responsible for a component or a set of component, but it's usually, and you'll do some sort of a project management, like the job has a little bit of a project management aspect, but it's not a 9-to-5 kind of full-time thing where you're doing this, right? It's like, I'm running a bunch of teams who are operating under such in such an environment, and we are on a continuous delivery model, right? So at the end of the week or at the end of every 2 weeks, depending on how we cut iterations, which is sometimes a little bit different, we are delivering something, right? And even if we're not pushing it out to a production system, we might at least push it out into some staging system or some other place. And that kind of the thing that it's there, that it's running, that I can use it and test it, that's good enough as the reporting factor of like, the changes that I'm doing are much more incremental, I do much less, but I'm deploying much more frequent, which kind of abolishes some of these traditional roles that you had in creating packaged software development. Right? And I think that's a change that you would see not only with IBM, but throughout the industry.
Yeah, move away from that monolithic release cycle to each component team, effectively microservice team, can function and operate independently of the others and iterate as fast as they can move. And you know, it's not a project manager role telling us anymore when to deliver and did we deliver the right thing. It's the consumers of the service. It's the customers who are using it, and we know that quick, you know, if we've hit the mark or not.
But make no mistake, this is it is a transition that doesn't work smoothly, and that is also painful, right?
It's a hard, painful
it's a hard
transition.
thing to do.
Yeah, it's a cultural change. It's not just one day you decide you're going to do continuous delivery and structure this way. It takes time to get an organization, a culture shifted to an organization structure and a development culture. You know, the organization to support a development culture to enable that, and then to really become productive at that.
With, you know, with that changing culture, the changing job roles, the disappearance of job roles, what are the emerging job roles and the newer roles that you're seeing come out of this?
It's expanding the zones. We're going back to expanding the zones, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that what used to be the operator, that you just give someone a you know, here's a piece of software and here's some kind of a deployment guide. Now go off and, you know, deploy and run this thing. I mean, that job is definitely going away. The deployment guide is replaced by a CI/CD pipeline. And the operator is you know, moving up the stack in the sense that he now starts to you know, write some code, figure out some of the configurations, that sort of stuff. And in the same way, it's coming. I mean, you know, project manager again. Usually, if you have something where you're responsible end to end, there is this one person, and we call it you know, in our tribe, we call it a PM style of role, which is a very technical role, but it has a little bit of a project management aspect to it. So what used to be the architect in the old days, right, and what used to be the project manager in the old days are kind of now blending into one kind of person who's you know, taking an end-to-end view and an end-to-end responsibility for a given component or a given microservice.
Yeah, the other cultural shift that I've seen that I really like, and it's that developer and operator zone, again, thought here, where operators aren't just operators. It's a technical development role, and it's a collaborative role with the developers. So it's a closed loop process. It's not, you know, as we've said a couple times here, developer writes code, compiles it, does some unit tests, throws it over the wall, and somebody else tests it and delivers it. It's more of a closed loop collaborative model where everyone is contributing some measure of code back to the success of the delivery.
I was just going to see if anyone would actually know the future birthplace. I don't see any responses, so I was going to tweet it out, but we'll get to that later. But a lot has changed, too, in terms of the declarative infrastructure that we have now. Mm-hmm. Infrastructure is so much more programmable now.
Yes.
And we're starting to see the programmable nature of infrastructure start to actually affect the front-end development, too. The emergence of these new headless CMSs, for example, that allow you to make updates in very much of kind of a DevOps-oriented way, where there's, you know, okay, so there's a copy edit issue on the front page of the web, you know, of the website. You know, maybe it's a manager sees that, you know, posts it, and then it just, you know, someone says, oh, okay, I have to complete that task, so that site gets up, so it gets updated. So it becomes more of like a continuous process in itself. And so it's that the declarative nature is very much changing the developer experience too, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly the developer experience, not having to worry about or wait upon someone to configure infrastructure for you and then tell you, here's your infrastructure that you can develop on and deploy to, and then you go, oh, that's not what I was looking for, it's not what I needed. Certainly I think every developer is is happy that those days are gone, where you can focus on the task at hand, the business problem you're trying to solve, and put all of your energies there, and have that infrastructure be, dynamic, where you do get infrastructure as code, and you can request what you need from the infrastructure to support your business application.
Mm-hmm. No, but you're touching on a very important point that I actually forgot. I mean, I was kind of subsuming this into this transformation sentences that I said earlier. But there is one point which I think is worth to spell out explicitly. This programmable infrastructure really gets us into this. I think it's sometimes called the pet versus cattle kind of discussion, right? And whether that's a good analogy or not, we'll debate some other time. But the idea on the pet versus cattle thing is really that I, as a developer, if I can program my infrastructure, I'm just gonna do that, and I'm gonna throw stuff away, right? Rather than spending 3 days trying to troubleshoot why this one VM got hung. This one night, right? I'm just gonna nuke it and just gonna trash it, get myself a new one, and keep on going, and maybe not even go down to the path of saying, okay, let's do, if it happens only once in a blue moon, going down to the path of saying, okay, let's do a full-blown root cause analysis like we did in the old days. It's just not worth the time, not worth the money. There was some hiccup. We don't understand it yet. We acknowledge that we maybe don't understand it yet. It's a one-off kind of thing. We'll just trash it and move on.
It's a good enough.
It's good enough, right? It's a good enough.
Yep.
That's a real change, the good enough philosophy.
That was a hard cultural shift within IBM to get to as well, the good enough philosophy. And I know I personally struggled with it for a while just because of cultural history and where I was coming from. But good enough is actually liberating once you adopt that philosophy, because you always can make it good enough and even better and even better and even better. So good enough today will be even better tomorrow. And the important thing is you just get started, right? And you just start.
And that good enough philosophy really then speaks to the importance of testing and why testing is becoming so critical in distributed architectures where microservices are used and you're relying on monitoring far more than you ever were before.
Testing, API contracts, API contracts between the microservices,
Yes.
test-driven development, CI/CD pipelines. I mean, we're circling back on, that's all in the zone of a developer today, and this is all what, when you look at 5 years back, what has been changing, or even longer. These are the skills. Like today, if you do not have, let's say, CI/CD skills, if you do not have TDD skills, you're not going to deliver a good cloud-based product. I'm a firm believer of that, right? So if you don't have that, there's no way you will be successful in the end.
Right, because you find out very quickly how important that pipeline is for test and delivery as part of your CI/CD process.
Right. And that must be an ongoing process internally at IBM.
And continually being improved. It definitely is, yes, yes.
It's one of the hardest things I think anyone from any profession has, but has trouble getting accustomed to when they first get started. And I think of our own, the profession I'm in, right, as a journalist, right, where there was always such a high degree of attention put on to the quality of what you're doing, because you really didn't have the chance to fix it again. Right. You really didn't have that opportunity. You had to get it right exactly the first time.
Right.
When it got printed, you were out of the.
You were done.
You were done.
Yep.
You're done.
Yep.
And same thing 10 years ago. Once it was on a DVD,
you were done. You were
Today,
done.
if you just ship it live as a service and it shows up in someone's browsers, and let's not assume you do, but you actually screw up, 5 minutes later you have the possibility to fix it.
Right. And you've also got flexibility of controlled rollout too. You can do dark launches, and if it doesn't work, You
A/B
can retract
testing.
it, A/B testing. You can pull it back and with no, limited to no impact to your users. So you've got a lot more flexibility and changing quickly.
And then that speaks then why versioning is so increasingly critical. Why you need to have versioning as such a key part of your process, because if you don't, you're lost.
I totally agree.
Yep.
And for what it's worth, even some of the tools that we're using today are, when it comes to versioning, not where they're supposed to be. I'm just talking about, I'm not sure if you've been following, let's say, Cloud Foundry versus there's this new upcoming project from Google called Knative. That also has a little bit of a, there's some similarities about, hey, here's just my code and some magic happens and then I'll get a container run. Although both have a versioning mechanism built into, they handle it very differently. And from my personal view of the world, it actually, the way how Knative does it is like, you just say that they started it 5 years after Cloud Foundry did, and they learned 5 years of cloud development and built that into their tools, right? I mean, the tool itself not as mature yet, very clearly, right? And it'll take many months until it gets to the same level of matureness. But looking at the concept and seeing how they used it and applied it, I think it just speaks that this observation is done throughout the industry, and it's starting to get fed into the tools and the technology that every developer now starts adopting. Right? So I think that is we're going to converge on that there. Yeah, and versioning definitely, if you screw up your versioning, not a good thing.
There's so many dimensions to this that we are exploring and trying to understand, and I would love to follow up another time. I mean, if you get into, for instance, like issues of state and statelessness, and how you think about versioning in that context, and how you can preserve state, and how you can use that state for future purposes. That seems like the direction that we're heading. Does it to you? Where you're starting to think, for instance, like if you're thinking about versioning, right? You're thinking about versioning and using it for version but now you're thinking about data, right? And the data and like the amount of data and like how can you think of data from a versioning perspective so you can keep it on a shelf and reuse it? The whole developer experience is going to has to be shifting toward kind of that context and understanding as well.
It does, and it does. I mean, it does and it doesn't. I mean, in there's one way where I would say you're absolutely right. And this is like, I mean, to me, data is really in the modern world belonging to some kind of a microservice. I'm just going to call it a microservice. And you're going to have, I'm not going to call it a schema, but you'll have some data model, right? In the old days, that would have been an SQL schema. Right now, it's maybe just a JSON format or a JSON file that corresponds to a specific format that is lying on some kind of an object store or whatever. And they go kind of in lockstep, but given that the data is more unstructured than it used to be within a relational database, you have the possibility that the data grows with your software. And I think that is like you could have version 1 of the software corresponds to version 1 of the schema, version 2 of the software maybe corresponds to version 2 of the data, but version 2 is compatible to version 1, so even with a version 2 software, you could read a version 1 schema or vice versa.
Fascinating topic. I think we're going to have to finish up this live stream, but I have not seen anyone come up with the answer yet. So what is the future birthday of James T. Kirk, Captain James T. Kirk of Star Trek?
Riverside, Iowa is the future birthplace.
And what is the first? What is the year of his future?
I think I'd have to look this back up.
We'll have to look it up.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look it up, but I seem to remember it was 2025, but I'd have to look it up. And I hope there's not another town out there that's also claimed that, but I know Riverside, Iowa had the audacity to claim that, so it's awesome.
Well, that brings up a whole other conversation about state that we can talk about another time.
Yes.
But thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun talking with you both. I really appreciate it. I've been joined by Tammy Van Hove, a distinguished engineer at IBM, and Simon Moser, senior technical staff member at IBM Germany Research and Development. Thank you so much for your time, and we're going to have a great show, and and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
This episode of the New Stack Makers is sponsored by the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Software is at the center of business, and open source is at the center of software. With Cloud Foundry, businesses can make running software at scale a reality. Learn more about Cloud Foundry at cloudfoundry.org. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.